Welcome back to the report. Now, a year on from the fierce battles in the Central African Republic, the consequences of the conflict and fears for the nation's remaining Muslim population are still very much alive. Reporter Yasmin Khatun has been following the story.
A year on from the deadly day in which over 1,000 people were killed in Bangui, this paediatric hospital is a lifeline for many children in the conflict that has engulfed the Central African Republic. Struggling to assist the youngest victims, it was set up to deal with the influx of malnourished children fleeing violence. The conflict in C.A.R has engulfed the region with refugees fleeing for safety as anti-Balaka attacks targeted Muslim communities.
It's entirely possible that in just a few weeks from now there will be no more Muslims in Bangui and much of the west of Central African Republic.
With an unprecedented level of conflict and its devastating consequences, thousands have been killed in the last year, and over the last 2 years at least 1 million have been displaced. As many fled to neighbouring countries, more than 600,000 people remain displaced inside C.A.R. Many trapped in enclaves they cannot escape. Here in Bangui, Hospital Director Dr. Jean-Christophe Gaudy expresses concern that previous gains made in the country against diseases like malaria have been reversed, with severe malnutrition also on the rise.
Tous les programmes, comme par exemple le programme de lutte contre le paludisme, qui étaient affectés parce que le personnel était parti, la gestion des médicaments ne se faisait plus, la distribution des moustiquaires ne faisait pas. Donc du coup, on a eu une recrudescence du paludisme grave, avec les conséquences que je lui avais données, où la mortalité était passée de moins de 5% avant la crise à plus de 10% maintenant. Ensuite, maintenant, quelque chose qui était attendu, vous savez, quand il y a la crise, donc du coup, ça a déclenché la malnutrition aiguë.
Despite gold and diamond reserves, C.A.R is one of the world's poorest countries and suffered on the back of corrupt leaders. In March 2013, the mostly Seleka Muslim rebels seized power, prompting a backlash from mainly Christian militia known as the Anti-Balaka, the group responsible for what Amnesty International has called ethno-religious cleansing. Since the beginning of the conflict, this paediatric hospital became a war hospital, treating gunshot wounds and other trauma cases.
Du côté chirurgical, nous avions eu l'appui de certains partenaires, notamment Emergency, qui nous a aidés à prendre à prendre en charge tous les cas de traumatisme par balle. Et donc du coup, on avait opéré pas mal d'enfants et sauvé pas mal d'enfants. Et je puis vous dire que on a eu à peine moins de 3% de décès avec cette aide-là.
A year on from the inception of the Battle of Bangui, the city is quiet of the thousands of Muslims who were killed and the many thousands who fled for their lives. But for those who remain, trapped in the landlocked nation, the battle for their health, safety and existence is very much alive. Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss the current situation in the Central African Republic, we have Professor Philip Burham, Honorary Director at the International African Institute. And on the line, I'm joined by Mudge, who's an Africa researcher at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the programme. Lewis, first of all, is it your understanding, really, that what we're looking at on the ground now is what has been a largely, if horribly successful ethnic cleansing?
Well, we're not using the term ethnic cleansing, but I think that's a moot point. I've just got back from the country a few weeks ago, and yeah, I mean, what we're looking at is, in particular, the west of the country. Hundreds of thousands of Central Africans who are Muslim have chosen to flee, and there's a few remaining in pockets. It's important to point out that the country's effectively been cut in half. The Seleka were routed in early 2014 by French forces, and the anti-Balaka filled that volume. But the Seleka have now moved to the east. They've established military headquarters in Bambari, a major city in the east, and they effectively control the eastern part of that country. A lot of that part of the country is bush, but it is important to note that the Central African Republic has not been emptied of Muslims. The West, which is the economic heart of the country, has certainly been.
Okay. Philip, give us some kind of context here, say over a 10-year time span. Is this the worst condition that this country has found itself in?
Oh, certainly in terms of refugees and the increase in disease and so forth. But on the other hand, there has been a whole series of coups and militias locally operating, which have provoked a lot of problems over a good many years before this. This has never been a very calm country for 30 or more years at least.
So are we saying sort of within that kind of perspective that the country will hold together because it's held together in previous periods like this? Or are we saying that there's something perhaps more dangerous about this current situation?
Well, I seriously doubt that it will divide. The Seleka, half of the country, has hardly any resources, very underdeveloped, and they don't really have the capacity to hold out against any concerted effort in retaking that part of the country. Whether and when that will happen exactly, I don't know. This could go on for some time, but eventually I think you'll see a reestablishment of the borders, the present borders.
Lewis, is that how you see it? That the country is sort of de facto divided at the moment, but that won't necessarily last?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Philip that the Seleka won't be able to hold out, but it's important to note that this is not exactly a country that was a really functioning state to begin with. The Seleka took over in their March 2013 coup because of the fact that the Bozizi government had hollowed out this country. The Seleka originate from the northeast, from many of them from a city called Birao, and this hasn't been under central government control for years. This is the wild, wild west. And so, yeah, you're going to see with the UN peacekeeping mission that started in mid-September, you'll see the borders more or less stabilized at some point, hopefully in the next sort of 18 months to 2 years outlook. But, controlling the country and getting central state authority, that's going to be something that's much further down the line. And that's frankly a problem. That's what's led to the Seleka coup. Bozizi didn't control the country, and Patesse before Bozizi in the 90s didn't control the country either.
Okay, just let's spend a moment then on one of the other aspects that we flagged up in that report, and that's the impact on the health infrastructure and the spread of disease. How serious is that?
Well, it's serious, but you have to recognize that that outside of Bangui you had very little infrastructure prior to these recent events. The state was not in a position to really supply the needs of its population, and the state effectively had contracted down onto the area around Bangui. So it is a bad situation, but it's not like it was ever that much better, frankly.
Well, look, there's a kind of story emerging here from both Lewis's responses and yours. Yeah. We should say, look, this is terrible, but it's been terrible for a long time, and it probably isn't going to get any better. Now, if we were to step back from this and say, look, the people living in this region have had a thoroughly miserable, disaster-prone experience for generations. What would it take to make some difference here? I mean, that's what most people watching this think. How can you just watch a country that is barely hanging together go on like this? What would it take to make life better for those people?
Well, unfortunately, the Central African Republic is usually out of the news except for when these bad things happen. And the international community, it's a question of out of sight, out of mind. They really haven't put in all that much effort. I agree very strongly with Lewis that it's a lack of an effective state organization and administration, and particularly an administration of justice, courts and an effective police force and so forth. That hasn't been there. I mean, I worked in this area in the 1960s, and there wasn't an effective state at that time. So to really put things into a functioning state would be a really major job, and one worries that as soon as things calm down a bit more, it will go onto the back burner as it has so often done in the past.
Yeah. So, Lewis, if you know, let me put the same point to you.
Sure.
What would be necessary to lift it out of this continual cycle of a pretty disastrous existence for the population?
Yeah. No, I'm happy to address that. But I just want to get to one point you mentioned earlier. Just to be clear, things are much worse now than they've ever been in the Central African Republic. We're talking about a country that has an individual in the ICC on the docks right now, Jean-Pierre Bemba, a Congolese warlord. He's been indicted for crimes committed in the Central African Republic in 2003. So yes, it's a country that's seen its fair share of bad times. But this is unprecedented in the country's history. I've been there 12 times since the coup, and this is what I'm hearing over and over again. We're not used to this. We're not habituated to this level of misery. So it is important to highlight that this is by far and away the worst it's ever been. In terms of what can make this better, look, I think there's a great opportunity here for individuals such as myself who did advocate very strongly for a UN peacekeeping mission. I think the international community, as Philippe did point out, it has a history of neglecting the Central African Republic, but there also is an opportunity here to think outside the box. There's a transitional government that's in place now. This transitional government has taken a really enormous step in asking the United Nations to help set up courts that will be both run by local judges and local prosecutors and investigators, and also international ones. And that's a huge step in addressing impunity, which is a main driver of conflict in this country. The fact of the matter is that no one's ever held accountable for all the killing that they do. So that has to be addressed. In terms of peacekeeping, look, this is not the Congo. Yes, everyone says this is a country the size of France, but we're dealing with 4.5 million people. We're not dealing with 62, 63 million people that we have in the DRC. The infrastructure is very, very bad, but the topography is a lot easier than the Congo. You can get a lot done with attack helicopters in the Central African Republic that you could not get done in the Congo. So I do think there is space for optimism with this UN peacekeeping mission that did take over from the African Union in September. A year ago, everyone was saying this was not going to be possible. Now they're on the ground. That means they have good funding for civilian components to come in and help run courts, for people to get the judicial system up and running, for schools to reopen. So I do think there's space for optimism. Yes, it's the UN peacekeeping mission, which is always a bit clunky and bureaucratic and never really works as well as anyone hoped it would. But I think if the focus can stay on the Central African Republic, not so much in the media, but more in the sense that this UN mission is given the funding and the individuals that it needs to be effective, I think we could see some things turn around in the 4 or 5 years.
Okay, Philip. I mean, well, let me ask you. There's 2 points there. I mean, Lewis is saying very definitely there that it is worse than before, and I thought perhaps in the earlier thing you were saying, well, it's pretty much business as usual.
No. I'm sorry if I've misexpressed myself. I fully agree with what he's just said.
And do you agree that there are some sort of chinks of light there emerging, which he seemed to be saying with the UN mission?
Well, I think, like he said, the creation of courts, if that can actually be done effectively, that would be very good. But you need a functioning administration. You need a way of financially supporting the country, tax collection, all the infrastructure of state administration needs to be put in place. What I'm afraid might happen is that the UN might move too rapidly to elections. Elections are the kind of panacea for these kinds of cases. But if you don't have a functioning state, it's very easy for elections to create the conditions for a reestablishment of either a dictatorship or some kind of quite partial ineffective administration. So I'm looking over, a longer period of time, which I think is what Lewis, the sort of time frame that Lewis was talking about there just a moment ago.
OK, Philip Burham in the studio, Lewis Mudge on the line. Thanks very much for that discussion. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in this episode of The Report. I want to thank all my guests on today's show, and thank you at home for watching. Do remember you can keep up with us by following us on Twitter @Islam Channel and by using the hashtag The Report. But for now, we'll return to a story that we covered earlier in the programme and leave you with those scenes from Cologne last night, where the cathedral city's lights were turned out in protest at the anti-Muslim rally that was taking place in the city. Well, the lights will be back on for The Report tomorrow night, but until then, good night.